This story will help you drift into a peaceful sleep. Where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and let's drift into peaceful dreams. Shadows on the wall. The flashlight flickered. A faint hum filled the room, low and droning, like the sound of an unseen swarm. Riel tightened her grip on the handle of the flashlight and whispered, "Do you hear that?" Her younger brother, Alex, stood frozen by the cracked window, his breath fogging the glass. The old house creaked as if it were breathing around them, the shadows on the walls stretching unnaturally long under the faint moonlight. "I don't like this," Alex muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum. "You think I do?" Riel shot back, her tone sharp but trembling. She aimed the weak beam of light toward the corner of the room, illuminating peeling wallpaper and a broken chair. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor beneath their feet. "What is that?" Alex whispered. Riel didn't answer. She was staring at the far wall, where their shadows should have been. But there were three. Her heart stuttered. The third shadow moved. "Alex," she said quietly, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "Get over here." Slowly, Alex turned, his eyes wide as he followed her gaze. The third shadow was taller than either of them, unnaturally thin, and its limbs seemed to stretch at odd angles. It tilted its head toward them, as if listening. "Is that us?" Alex asked, his voice breaking. "No," Riel said, her voice barely a whisper. "No, it's not." The shadow stepped forward. The hum turned into a low growl, reverberating through the room, and the flashlight sputtered violently before plunging them into darkness. Riel fumbled with the flashlight, her fingers shaking, her breath shallow and rapid. "Riel!" Alex's voice cracked with fear. "I'm trying," she hissed, slapping the flashlight. A spark of light returned, weak and sputtering, but enough to illuminate the shadow. It was closer now, too close. Its head craned unnaturally, almost upside down, as it loomed over Alex. The edges of its form rippled, as though it were barely clinging to the shape it had taken. "Run!" Riel screamed, grabbing Alex's arm and dragging him toward the door. The hum swelled into a deafening roar, the walls shuddering as if the house itself were alive. They stumbled into the hallway, the wooden floor groaning under their weight. The shadows followed. "Which way?" Alex shouted, his voice frantic. "Just go," Riel yelled, pulling him toward the staircase. Behind them, the shadows swarmed, slithering along the walls like liquid darkness. The air grew colder with each step, their breaths fogging in front of them. "Don't look back," Riel gasped, but Alex couldn't help himself. He glanced over his shoulder and froze. "What's wrong?" Riel yanked at his arm, but he wouldn't budge. "Riel," his voice was hollow. She turned to see what had stopped him. The shadows weren't chasing them anymore. They were standing still, lined up along the walls, mimicking the shapes of people. But there was something in their hands, something sharp, glinting even in the dim light. And then they moved again, faster this time, their footsteps silent as they closed in. "Go!" Riel screamed, shoving Alex forward, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of something heavy slamming shut behind them. The door at the top of the staircase. They were trapped. Riel's pulse hammered in her ears as she tugged at the door handle, but it didn't budge. "Locked. Help me," she shouted, her voice raw with desperation. Alex, still pale from what he'd seen, rushed to her side, throwing his weight against the door. It groaned but held firm, as if the house itself refused to let them leave. Behind them, the shadows moved closer, their silent footsteps heavy with menace. Riel turned, pressing her back against the door. Her flashlight was nearly dead, casting jittery beams of light across the walls. "We have to do something," Alex cried, his voice breaking. The shadows stopped, no more than a few feet away. They hovered, their forms flickering like static on an old television. One by one, they raised their arms, pointing toward Riel and Alex. "Why are they just standing there?" Alex whispered. Riel shook her head, her throat dry. "I don't think they're waiting. I think they're deciding." The hum returned, low and bone deep, vibrating through the air. The temperature plummeted further, and Brielle's breath came out in sharp, white puffs. A loud creak made them both jump. The floorboards beneath their feet began to shift, the wood splintering and cracking as if something beneath the house was trying to break free. Move! Brielle grabbed Alex's arm, yanking him away from the weakening floor. They stumbled down the hallway, the shadows slithering after them. Doors lined the hall on either side, each one slightly ajar. Some led to empty rooms, others to walls where doors shouldn't have been. The layout of the house no longer made sense. It twisted and stretched as if it had come alive. Pick one, Alex shouted. Brielle shoved open a door at random, revealing a spiral staircase descending into darkness. It hadn't been there before. Down, she said, her voice shaking. Are you insane? We don't even know what's down there. You want to stay here? Brielle snapped, pointing behind them. The shadows were closing in again, their elongated limbs brushing against the walls as they advanced. Alex didn't argue. He bolted for the staircase, with Brielle right behind him. The steps creaked and groaned under their weight, the air growing colder and thicker with each step they took. Keep going, Brielle urged, her flashlight barely illuminating the way. The hum followed them, echoing down the staircase like a distant, malevolent chant. Suddenly, Alex froze. What is it? Brielle asked, her voice sharp. Alex pointed ahead, his hand trembling. The beam of light revealed the bottom of the staircase, or what should have been the bottom. Instead, the steps ended abruptly in midair, plunging into a black void that seemed to stretch endlessly below them. There's no floor, Alex said, his voice hollow. Brielle's stomach dropped. The staircase swayed slightly beneath them, as if mocking their hesitation. Behind them, the shadows were descending, their formless shapes oozing down the steps with a terrifying, deliberate calm. We're trapped, Alex whispered. No, Brielle said, her mind racing. No, we're not. She swung the flashlight around, searching for any sign of a path. The beam landed on something faint, a thin, fraying rope stretched across the void, connected to a narrow ledge on the other side. A rope bridge, she breathed. That's your plan. Alex's voice was incredulous. You have a better one. The shadows reached the edge of the staircase, their forms twisting and writhing as they loomed over the siblings. The hum grew louder, drowning out all other sound. Brielle didn't wait for Alex's answer. She stepped onto the rope, her hands gripping the sides as it swayed precariously. The void below seemed to pull at her, a cold emptiness that threatened to swallow her whole. Come on, she shouted, her voice nearly lost in the rising hum. Alex hesitated for a moment, then followed, his knuckles white as he clung to the rope. The bridge creaked under their weight, each step an agonizing gamble. The shadows didn't hesitate. They stepped onto the bridge, their movements unnaturally smooth, their forms shifting like smoke. They're coming, Alex said, his voice trembling. I know, Brielle replied, her focus locked on the ledge ahead. It seemed impossibly far, the distance stretching with every step. The rope beneath her feet began to fray, thin strands snapping one by one. Hurry, she yelled, quickening her pace. But the shadows were faster. One of them reached out, its long, spindly arm brushing against Alex's shoulder. He screamed. Alex's scream tore through the darkness, sending a chill through Brielle's spine. She spun her head, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The shadow's tendril-like arm clung to Alex's shoulder, and where it touched, the fabric of his jacket began to dissolve, curling into ash. Get it off me, Alex shouted, thrashing wildly. The rope bridge swayed violently under his frantic movements. Hold still, Brielle yelled back, though her own voice trembled. She reached for him, but Alex recoiled, almost losing his footing. The shadow tightened its grip, and Alex gasped as a dark stain spread across his shoulder, like frostbite in fast motion. His movement slowed, his face pale and contorted in pain. Don't stop, Brielle screamed. She dropped the flashlight, letting it dangle by its wrist strap, and lunged for Alex, her fingers fumbling to tear him free. The bridge creaked ominously beneath them, the fraying rope groaning with every shift. With a guttural cry, Riel yanked at Alex's arm. The tendril released him with an unnatural hiss, snapping back toward the other shadows. Alex stumbled forward, clutching his shoulder, his breaths ragged. "Are you okay?" Riel asked, her voice frantic. "I don't know," Alex said between gasps, his hand trembling as he pulled his jacket away to reveal the skin beneath. It was darkened, almost black, with jagged, vein-like lines spidering out from the spot where the shadow had touched him. "We need to keep moving," Riel said, her eyes darting to the advancing shadows. They were closer now, their forms rippling and merging as if they were one living entity. The rope bridge swayed again, more violently this time, and a loud snap echoed through the void. Riel's heart sank as she looked down. One of the ropes securing the bridge had snapped loose, and the remaining strands were beginning to unravel. "We're running out of time," she said, gripping Alex's hand and pulling him forward. The ledge was closer now, but every step felt like an eternity. The air grew thicker, pressing against their chests, making it harder to breathe. The hum had turned into a deep, resonant vibration, as though the void itself were alive and hungry. Behind them, the shadows surged forward, spilling across the bridge like liquid darkness. They moved with terrifying speed, their shapes shifting and morphing into jagged, claw-like forms. "Go faster!" Riel yelled, but Alex was slowing down, his injured shoulder dragging him down like an anchor. "I can't," Alex gasped. "Yes, you can," Riel snapped, her voice laced with desperation. She tightened her grip on his arm, practically dragging him now. The ledge was just a few steps away when the bridge gave a final, shuddering lurch. With a deafening crack, the rope snapped completely, and the bridge tilted violently to one side. "Jump!" Riel screamed. Without thinking, she pushed Alex forward. He stumbled, his foot slipping on the frayed wood, but he leaped for the ledge, his fingers barely catching the edge. Riel wasn't so lucky. The bridge swung out from under her, and she plummeted toward the void. Her hand shot out, grabbing onto the broken end of the bridge just in time. "Riel!" Alex shouted, his face pale and panicked as he scrambled onto the ledge. "I'm fine," Riel lied, her arms straining as she tried to pull herself up. Below her, the void seemed to pulse, its darkness shifting and swirling like a living thing. The shadows were still coming. They slithered down the broken bridge, their clawed hands reaching for her. "Alex, help me!" Riel yelled, her grip slipping. Alex reached out, his injured arm trembling as he stretched toward her. Their fingers brushed, but it wasn't enough. "Try again," Riel shouted, her voice cracking. Alex gritted his teeth, leaning farther over the ledge. This time, he caught her wrist, his grip firm despite the pain etched across his face. With a grunt of effort, he pulled her up, and they collapsed onto the ledge together, gasping for air. But the relief was short-lived. The shadows had reached the edge of the broken bridge, and they didn't stop. They began to pour into the void, their forms twisting and reshaping into long, snake-like tendrils that stretched toward the siblings. Riel scrambled to her feet, yanking Alex up with her. The ledge they stood on was narrow, with nowhere to go but a jagged archway carved into the stone wall ahead. "This way," Riel said, dragging Alex toward the archway. As they stumbled through, the hum stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie, suffocating silence. They found themselves in a narrow corridor, the walls slick with moisture and covered in strange, glowing symbols that pulsed faintly. "What is this place?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Riel said, her eyes scanning the walls. "But we can't stop now." The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, the glowing symbols growing brighter with each step they took. Behind them, the shadows hesitated at the archway, their forms flickering as if the symbols repelled them. But they weren't retreating. Instead, they began to gather, their shapes merging into something larger, something far more terrifying. Riel and Alex didn't look back. They ran, their footsteps echoing through the corridor, the light from the symbols casting twisted shadows on the walls. And behind them, The darkness surged forward, relentless and hungry. The corridor seemed endless, its slick walls narrowing the farther Brielle and Alex ran. The glowing symbols pulsed faster now, like the rhythm of a frantic heartbeat, casting fleeting flashes of light that barely illuminated the path ahead. "You hear that?" Alex asked, his voice hoarse. Brielle didn't answer. She was focused on the sound that had replaced the hum, a deep, guttural rumble, like something massive stirring just out of sight. "It's getting closer," Alex said, glancing over his shoulder. "Don't look back." Brielle snapped, grabbing his arm to keep him moving. Her own fear churned in her stomach, threatening to consume her, but she pushed it down. They didn't have time for fear. The walls began to change. The glowing symbols grew more erratic, their patterns twisting and shifting as if alive. The air thickened with a metallic tang, making it harder to breathe. "What's happening to the walls?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Brielle replied, her eyes darting to the symbols. They seemed to writhe and ripple, their glow casting warped shadows that danced along the corridor. Behind them, the rumble deepened, and the sound of scraping claws echoed through the tunnel. Brielle didn't dare look back, but she could feel it. Something immense was following them, something far worse than the shadows they had seen before. "Faster," she urged, pulling Alex along. The corridor opened suddenly into a cavernous chamber. Brielle skidded to a stop, her heart pounding. The ceiling stretched high above them, disappearing into darkness, while jagged pillars of stone jutted out of the floor like teeth. In the center of the chamber stood a massive, circular platform, its surface etched with the same glowing symbols that covered the walls. The light from the symbols pulsed brighter here, almost blinded, but the platform radiated an unnatural cold. "What is this place?" Alex asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Brielle said, stepping cautiously onto the platform. The moment her foot touched it, the symbols flared to life, their light flooding the chamber. A low growl rumbled through the air, and Brielle turned to see the shadows emerging from the corridor. They poured into the chamber like a living flood, their forms shifting and merging into something massive, a towering figure with elongated limbs and eyes like burning coals. "Alex," Brielle said, her voice barely audible. He didn't respond. He was staring at the platform, his expression blank, his body frozen. "Alex," Brielle shouted, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him. His eyes snapped to hers, wide and glassy. "It's in my head," he whispered. "I can feel it." "What are you talking about?" "The symbols," Alex said, clutching his head. "They're talking to me." Before Brielle could respond, the towering shadow figure let out a deafening roar, its voice reverberating through the chamber. The ground trembled, cracks spidering out from the edges of the platform. "We have to go," Brielle shouted, pulling Alex toward the far side of the platform. "There's nowhere to go," Alex yelled back, gesturing to the chamber. The walls were smooth and unbroken, with no visible exit. Brielle's mind raced. She looked down at the symbols etched into the platform, their glow pulsing faster now, almost frantic. They had to mean something. She crouched down, running her fingers over the grooves. The symbols were cold to the touch, but they seemed to hum faintly under her fingertips. "What are you doing?" Alex asked, panic rising in his voice. "I think this is the way out," Brielle said, though she wasn't sure if she believed it. Behind them, the shadow figure took a step forward, its massive form shaking the ground with every movement. The smaller shadows swirled around it like a storm, their clawed hands reaching for the siblings. "Brielle, we don't have time for this," Alex yelled. "We don't have a choice." Brielle shot back. She pressed her hand flat against the largest symbol, and the platform trembled beneath her. The light from the symbols surged, filling the chamber with a blinding glow. The shadow figure roared again, its voice laced with fury, and lunged toward them. Brielle closed her eyes, bracing for impact, but instead of the crushing weight of the shadows, there was a sudden, deafening silence. She opened her eyes to find herself and Alex standing in complete darkness. The chamber was gone, the platform gone, Even the ground beneath their feet felt wrong. "Where are we?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. Brielle didn't answer. She was staring at the faint glimmer of light in the distance, a single, flickering point in the vast, oppressive darkness. And then the rumble started again, louder this time, closer. Something was moving in the dark, circling them, its presence as vast and suffocating as the void itself. Brielle reached for Alex's hand, her fingers trembling. "Stay close," she said, her voice shaking. The glimmer of light in the distance flickered, then disappeared, and the darkness moved. The darkness felt alive, pressing against Brielle and Alex with an almost tangible weight. It shifted around them, whispering in a language neither of them could understand. Every breath felt heavier, each one dragging shards of ice into their lungs. "Did you see it?" Alex whispered, gripping Brielle's arm so tightly she winced. "See what?" she asked, her voice low, barely audible. She strained her eyes against the suffocating blackness, but all she could make out were vague shapes, shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't. "There was something in the light," Alex murmured, "right before it disappeared. It was watching us." Brielle's pulse quickened. She didn't want to ask what he meant, didn't want to give form to the dread that gnawed at her insides. But the silence didn't feel safe either. "We need to keep moving," she said, pulling Alex forward. "That light, it was leading us somewhere. We have to find it again. You think we're supposed to go toward it?" Alex hissed. "What if it's a trap? You have a better idea." Brielle snapped, though the sharpness in her voice was more from fear than anger. "Standing here isn't exactly working out for us." The rumbling grew louder, reverberating through the void. Brielle felt it in her bones, a low, thrumming vibration that made her teeth ache. Whatever was circling them was closing in. "Fine," Alex muttered, "but if we see that light again, I'm not trusting it." They stumbled forward, each step tentative, the ground beneath them soft and yielding, like walking on ash. Brielle kept her hand outstretched, searching for anything, walls, objects, a clue to where they were. But there was nothing but empty air. Then the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound. Brielle froze, her hand tightening around Alex's. "What?" Alex began, but his words were cut off by a sharp, bone-chilling screech. It came from everywhere at once, high-pitched and grating, like nails dragged across glass. Brielle instinctively clapped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just in her ears, it was inside her head. "Run!" she shouted, though she couldn't hear her own voice over the screeching. She grabbed Alex's arm and pulled him forward, stumbling blindly into the darkness. The ground began to shift beneath them, rising and falling in waves. Brielle nearly lost her footing but forced herself to keep going. She couldn't stop. Not now. The screeching grew louder, sharper, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. "Do you feel that?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. Brielle nodded, though she didn't know if he could see her. The air had changed again, growing colder and heavier, and then she realized it wasn't just the air. The darkness itself felt closer, thicker, like it was pressing against their skin. "Don't stop," she said, her voice shaking. "Keep moving." But Alex wasn't moving. His hand slipped from hers, and when she turned to look at him, she saw his face, pale and rigid, his eyes wide with terror. He was staring at something behind her. Brielle didn't want to turn around. Every instinct screamed at her to keep going, to run. But the look on Alex's face rooted her to the spot. Slowly, she turned her head. The darkness wasn't empty anymore. A shape loomed before them, impossibly large, its edges flickering and shifting like smoke. It had no discernible features, but its presence was suffocating, its sheer size dwarfing them. And at its center, two pinpoints of red light burned like eyes. Brielle's breath caught in her throat. The thing didn't move, but she could feel it watching them, studying them. The red lights flared brighter, and the air around them grew colder still. "What is that?" Alex whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. "I don't know," Brielle replied, her own voice trembling. Her legs felt like lead, her body refusing to move. Every instinct told her to run, but her feet wouldn't obey. The red light shifted, and Brielle realized with growing horror that the thing was leaning closer. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the air, vibrating in her chest. "Go," she shouted, grabbing Alex's arm and shoving him forward. "Run." This time, Alex didn't argue. They bolted into the darkness, the ground shifting and undulating beneath their feet. The red lights followed, growing brighter with every step they took. The rumbling returned, louder now, accompanied by the sound of something enormous dragging itself through the void. Brielle didn't dare look back, but she could hear it. Hear the scraping, slithering sound of whatever the thing was gaining on them. And then, ahead of them, a faint light appeared. "There!" Brielle shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. She didn't care if it was a trap anymore. It was their only chance. The light grew brighter as they ran, but so did the sound behind them. Brielle could feel the thing's presence, its cold breath on the back of her neck. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. The light wasn't a single point anymore. It was a doorway, a jagged outline carved into the darkness. Beyond it, she could see faint shapes, blurry and indistinct, but real. "We're almost there," Brielle shouted, but then the ground shifted violently, throwing her off balance. She hit the ground hard, the impact jarring her bones. Alex skidded to a stop, turning back for her. "Brielle," he yelled, reaching out to her. She tried to get up, but the ground beneath her was crumbling, falling away into the void. The red lights flared brighter, and she felt a cold, claw-like grip wrap around her ankle. "Alex," she screamed, clawing at the ground as the thing began to drag her back into the darkness. Brielle's heart slammed against her ribs as the grip on her ankle tightened, pulling her toward the void. Her fingers scraped against the crumbling ground, but the surface was slick and unstable, giving way beneath her touch. She could feel the cold seep into her skin, as if the darkness itself was eating away at her. The red lights flared once more, casting an eerie glow over the cavernous space, and she gasped for air. "Alex!" she cried out, panic clawing at her throat. Alex's face twisted with terror as he rushed toward her, but the ground between them was crumbling fast. With every step he took, the earth seemed to give way, more of it falling into the black abyss below. He stretched his arm out toward her, his fingers barely grazing hers. "Brielle, no!" Alex shouted, his voice cracking. "I can't." The darkness pulsed around her like a living thing, the sensation of being watched overwhelming. Her breath came in short, desperate gasps as the cold hands of the void continued to pull her, inch by inch, further away from him. "No, please," she cried, but the darkness was relentless. The grip on her ankle didn't loosen. It dragged her further, the chills sinking deeper into her skin, and with each pull, she felt weaker, as though the very force of it was draining her strength. Alex's eyes were wide with horror, his face pale and drawn, but still, he refused to move back. "I won't leave you, Brielle," he shouted, his voice raw. He dropped to his knees, reaching desperately for her, his fingers brushing against the edge of the ground as the gap widened between them. "You have to," Brielle said through clenched teeth, her voice filled with urgency. She could feel the darkness tightening its grip on her leg, the pressure building like a vice around her calf. It's going to pull me in. You have to go." "No." Alex's voice was louder now, laced with something close to desperation. He refused to let go. His arms stretched farther, his body trembling as he inched closer to the edge. "Alex, go!" Brielle screamed, her voice sharp with fear. The words felt like they were being torn from her chest. "It's not safe." And then, without warning, the ground beneath Alex's feet cracked wide open. He let out a strangled yell, his body slipping, and before Brielle could react, he vanished into the darkness. The sound of his fall was brief but haunting, swallowed by the vastness of the abyss. "No!" Brielle screamed, her voice raw with terror. She clawed at the edge, her hand slipping, but she couldn't stop herself. from being pulled farther into the dark. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, it felt like she was suffocating in the weight of the void. The cold was everywhere now, seeping into her very bones. Her body refused to move, frozen in place, but her mind raced. The shape she had seen before, the enormous shadow with the red eyes, loomed in the corner of her vision. It wasn't far now. The air hummed with its presence, a sickening vibration that set her teeth on edge. A sudden, sharp pain in her leg made her gasp. The cold around her intensified, sharp like icy needles, piercing her flesh. She looked down at her ankle and saw dark, almost translucent tendrils of shadow curling up around her skin, sinking into her body. The shadows seemed to pulse with a rhythmic energy, like a heartbeat. With a burst of strength, Riel tore her hand free from the ground, scraping her palm raw against the jagged edges. She kicked and struggled, trying to dislodge the tendrils wrapping around her leg, but it was as if they were made of something harder than stone. They didn't break, they didn't budge, but then a flicker of light, just a glimmer at first, caught her eye. In the distance, beyond the ever-encroaching darkness, she saw the faint outline of what could be an exit. It was barely visible, but it was there, a way out. Her chest constricted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, a glimmer of hope pierced through the fear. "Alex, hold on," she whispered to herself, her voice shaky but determined. She couldn't, she wouldn't, let him be lost in this hellish place. There was a way out. She had to believe that. The tendrils of shadow gripped her leg tighter, a searing pain coursing up through her veins. The air around her thickened with the sensation of being watched, the oppressive darkness seeming to close in around her like a noose. Riel's pulse pounded in her ears as she forced herself to push forward, ignoring the pain in her leg. She reached toward the distant light, her body shaking, her hands trembling from the strain. Every part of her wanted to give in, to surrender to the cold embrace of the void. But she couldn't, not while there was a chance. She gritted her teeth and clawed her way forward, the darkness pressing against her, trying to drag her back. Another step, another. The ground trembled beneath her feet. The rumble returned, louder now, like the sound of something massive stirring beneath the surface. And the distant light flickered again, stronger this time. And then a voice. It was soft at first, like a whisper on the wind, but it grew louder, more insistent. Riel couldn't tell if it was inside her head or coming from the darkness itself, but the words were unmistakable. Turn back. It was followed by a deep, guttural laugh. Riel's heart skipped a beat as the voice echoed in her mind. The laughter, deep and haunting, reverberated through the very air, sending chills crawling down her spine. It was so close now. She could feel it, a presence that surrounded her from every direction. The voice was both familiar and foreign, like it had always been there, buried deep within her thoughts. Turn back, the voice repeated louder now, as though it was speaking directly into her ear. You can't escape. Her breathing became shallow, quick, and her hands trembled as she gripped the ground, willing herself to move. The distant light she had been chasing flickered again, pulling her toward it with an intensity that felt almost desperate. But the laughter was growing, swelling like a storm in her mind, drowning out everything else. You won't make it, the voice mocked. There's no escape. It's too late. Riel's leg burned where the tendrils of darkness still clung to her, but she couldn't focus on the pain. The voice was inside her now, clawing at her thoughts, unraveling the very fabric of her resolve. Alex, she whispered, her voice shaking, as if speaking his name could anchor her. But there was no answer. She was alone, surrounded by nothing but the oppressive weight of the void and the maddening voice that whispered its twisted promises. The ground beneath her seemed to shift again, as though the darkness itself was alive, breathing. The rumbling had grown louder, more insistent, and Riel could feel it beneath her feet, an ancient power stirring, rising like the tide. The light, her only hope, seemed to be slipping further away with each passing second, the distance between them stretching impossibly long. You can't outrun it, the voice taunted. It's inside you now. You belong to it. Brielle's breath caught in her throat. She tried to shake the voice away, but it clung to her like a weight, suffocating her, drowning her in its words. The shadows seemed to press in closer, wrapping around her, tightening like a noose. She refused to look back. She couldn't afford to. If she did, she feared what she might see, what might be waiting for her in the dark. Her legs were growing weaker, each step dragging her down, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The light ahead flickered again, brighter this time, as if it had sensed her desperation. She reached toward it, her hand trembling as it stretched, inch by agonizing inch, toward the glimmer of hope. A sudden, sharp pain shot through her chest. Her body froze, caught in the sharp sting of it. She gasped for air, her vision blurring as the pain overwhelmed her. The laughter grew louder, a deafening crescendo, as if it was feeding on her fear. "Turn back," it repeated over and over, its voice ringing in her ears like a maddening chant. "You can't escape. It knows you. It will find you." Brielle's breath came in ragged gasps as the pain in her chest spread, seeping into her limbs, her body growing heavier with every passing second. Her vision darkened, the light ahead blurring, the world spinning around her. She felt like she was drowning, sinking into the very darkness she had been running from. But then a sudden flash, something bright, something real, pierced through the blackness. It was blinding, almost unbearable, but it cut through the suffocating air like a blade, and for a moment the voice faltered. The laughter stopped. Brielle's body jerked, her hand still reaching toward the light, and then, with all the strength she could muster, she pushed forward. Her legs screamed in protest. Her chest felt like it was being crushed, but she kept moving, the light ahead growing stronger, closer. The voice was still there, lingering, whispering, but it was fading now, lost in the brightness that was overtaking the darkness. For a split second, she thought she might make it, but then, the ground beneath her feet cracked wide open. She felt herself falling, plummeting into the void, the light vanishing as the darkness swallowed her whole. "No!" she screamed, reaching out in vain. She could see nothing now, only the oppressive weight of the blackness surrounding her, and the feeling of falling, falling, falling. But something caught her, a hand, cold as ice, wrapped around her wrist, pulling her back. She gasped, her heart pounding, as she was dragged upward, her head spinning from the sudden motion. Her eyes snapped open, but all she could see was darkness. There was no light, no hope, only the suffocating feeling of being dragged into the unknown. The hand tightened on her wrist, and Brielle's breath hitched as she felt something cold and unyielding slip around her, locking her in place. Who is this?" she whispered, but the words barely escaped her lips. A voice, low and familiar, answered from the shadows. "You should have listened," it said softly. "It was never going to let you go." Brielle's heart stopped in her chest. She knew that voice. She'd heard it before, but it couldn't be. It couldn't. The hand pulled her deeper into the darkness, and the world around her blurred as she felt herself being consumed by it. The hand around her wrist tightened further, sending a shock of icy fear coursing through Brielle's body. She struggled to free herself, but it felt as though the darkness itself was holding her in place, pulling her down into its depths. The air around her was thick with an oppressive, suffocating energy, and the whispers, the relentless, maddening whispers, were back, surrounding her from all sides. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered again, its tone soft and dangerous. "It was never meant for you." Brielle's heart raced, her chest tightening with every word. She tried to look around, but all she could see was the crushing void, endless, black, and suffocating. The familiar chill of the hand on her wrist sent a jolt of terror through her. It was like ice, colder than anything she'd ever felt, seeping through her skin, invading her very bones. "No," she gasped, her voice breaking as she tried to pull away. "Please let go." But the grip only tightened, and the whispers grew louder. She could hear them now, like an army of voices, each one speaking at once. Their words tangled together in a dizzying chorus. It was impossible to make sense of them. But Brielle could feel the weight of their intent, the malice lacing every syllable. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick, stifling. Her head swam as the pressure around her chest grew unbearable. "You can't escape," the voice said again, closer now, like it was right next to her ear. "You're already part of it. The darkness is in you." Her pulse pounded in her ears as she fought against the hand. But it was useless. It was as if the darkness had taken root inside her, twisting around her heart, and every movement she made only seemed to strengthen its hold. "No!" she screamed, her voice raw and desperate. "I'm not like you." The grip on her wrist tightened even more, sending a sharp pain shooting up her arm. She could feel the coldness of it seeping deeper into her flesh, into her very soul. The laughter returned, low and mocking, swirling around her like a storm. "You think you can fight it?" The voice hissed, the tone filled with amusement. "It was always going to end like this. You never stood a chance." Brielle's body trembled with exhaustion, her mind fighting to hold onto reality. But everything was slipping away. The shadows were closing in, wrapping around her like a shroud. The ground beneath her feet was gone, and she felt herself falling again, weightless, surrounded by the pitch-black void. But just as the terror threatened to overwhelm her, she saw something, faint, distant, like a flicker of light at the edge of her vision. It was so small, so far away, but it was there, a sliver of hope, with the last ounce of strength she could muster. Brielle reached for it. Her hand moved through the air, feeling for something solid, anything that could pull her away from the suffocating darkness. The grip on her wrist loosened, just for a moment, just long enough. Brielle seized the opportunity. She yanked herself free, her body recoiling as if it had been set on fire. The light ahead grew larger, and she pushed forward, forcing herself to move even as the darkness clawed at her, trying to drag her back. The hand tried to grab her again, but she twisted, desperate to escape. The darkness screamed in fury, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. But Brielle didn't look back. She couldn't. The light was brighter now, almost blinding, and with each step, she felt herself getting closer, the warmth of it calling to her, urging her to come. But then the ground beneath her feet shifted again. This time, it didn't crack. It sank. Brielle felt herself falling once more, and panic surged through her chest. She reached out desperately, but there was nothing to grab, nothing to hold on to. The light ahead seemed to flicker, like it was fading away, just out of reach. Her body hit the ground hard, the impact jarring her senses. She scrambled to push herself up, but the shadows were there, swirling around her, crawling over her skin like a living, writhing thing. The voice came again, quieter now, but still present. "You can't escape what's inside you." She gasped for air, choking on the suffocating weight of the void around her. Her hands dug into the ground, but the darkness was everywhere, pressing in, surrounding her like a wall. And then something changed. A cold wind swept through the void, carrying with it the faint scent of something familiar, something real. Brielle's heart skipped as she recognized it. It was the scent of the earth, fresh and alive. It was the scent of the forest. The light flickered once more, this time with more clarity. It wasn't just a flicker. It was a doorway, a passage. But the shadows weren't giving up. They pulled at her, dragging her back, dragging her deeper into the void. The whispers surged, louder than before, almost deafening, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. "You can't escape," they hissed. "It's part of you." Brielle's heart raced. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep fighting, but she knew one thing. She couldn't stop now. She reached forward, every part of her screaming in resistance, but she stretched toward the light. If this was the last chance she had, the last shred of hope, she would take it, with a final, desperate push. She leaped into the light, her body tumbling through the air, her mind spinning, the darkness trying to pull her back. The voices screamed in fury, their words tangled in a whirlwind of anger and fear. And then, just as she thought she couldn't hold on any longer, she felt something solid beneath her feet, something warm, something real. She opened her eyes. The light was gone, but she was no longer in the void. She was in a forest, Riel's breath came in ragged gasps as her feet met solid ground. She looked around, blinking, her mind trying to make sense of the sudden shift in the air. The oppressive darkness, the cold grip that had held her so tightly, was gone, replaced by a damp, earthy scent that filled her lungs. The rustling of leaves in the wind filled her ears. But there was something wrong about it, something unnatural. The forest around her was dense, its towering trees casting long shadows in the dim light. She wasn't sure how she had gotten here, or what had happened to the void, but something told her this wasn't a safe place. The air was heavy, thick with tension. The silence that followed was almost worse than the whispers had been, as if the very world was holding its breath. A chill ran down her spine, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Something was watching her. Riel spun around, her eyes scanning the dark forest, but there was nothing. No sign of life, no movement, only the feeling, the unmistakable sensation, that something was lurking just out of sight. Her heart thudded in her chest. "Alex," she whispered into the silence. Her voice felt fragile, swallowed by the dense trees. She wasn't sure why she called out. Maybe it was the desperate hope that somehow, someway, he might still be out there. That this place, this strange and terrifying place, might hold the answers to what had happened to him. But there was no answer, not even an echo. Riel took a tentative step forward, her senses on high alert. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, spongy, as if the earth itself was alive, breathing beneath her. Every step she took felt unnatural, like the very land she walked on was shifting, reacting to her presence. She glanced over her shoulder, feeling the weight of the forest's silence pressing in on her. A low rustling sound came from deeper within the trees, followed by the snap of a twig. Riel froze, her pulse quickening. "Hello," she called again, but her voice trembled, betraying her fear. This time, there was a response. A figure moved through the shadows, quick and fluid, almost blending into the dark. Riel's heart skipped, and she instinctively took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes locked onto the figure, but it was too dark to make out any clear features. It moved again, closer, but just out of reach of the dim light that filtered through the thick canopy overhead. Riel's legs trembled as she backed up, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. The figure paused, its presence unnerving, and then it spoke in a voice that sent a shiver down her spine. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was soft, almost like a warning, but it held an edge, sharp, like a knife ready to strike. "This is not a place for the living." Riel's stomach churned. She could barely keep herself steady as the voice seemed to reverberate around her, bouncing off the trees, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating embrace. The words, the tone, they felt familiar, like the voice she had heard before, but it was impossible. It couldn't be. "Who are you?" Riel demanded, her voice steady despite the dread pooling in her gut. "What is this place?" The figure stepped closer, slowly, deliberately. The shadows seemed to cling to it, warping its shape, making it difficult to discern any details. It was tall, humanoid in shape, but there was something off about it, something unnatural. It felt as though it was made of the forest itself, like it had grown out of the trees and the earth. The voice spoke again, but this time, it was different. The tone was almost sad, mournful. "It was never meant for you. You shouldn't have crossed over." Riel's blood ran cold. She had no idea what the figure was talking about, but the words struck deep, pulling at something inside her. She had crossed over. Was this place some kind of threshold? And why was it so familiar? Why did it feel like she had been here before? Her thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of it. But before she could ask another question, the figure stepped fully into the dim light, revealing its face, or what should have been its face. There was nothing there but a smooth, featureless mask of shadow. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank, black surface that seemed to absorb the light around it. Riel stumbled back, her breath coming faster now. The absence of its face, the way it seemed to take in everything around it without ever truly existing, was too much for her to process. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Her mind was racing, but there were no answers. Only more questions, and an overwhelming sense that she wasn't alone in this place. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if studying her. The air around them grew heavier, charged with a palpable energy that made Brielle's skin crawl. She could feel something shifting, something in the fabric of the world itself, as if the very ground beneath her was waiting for something to happen. And then, as if deciding something, the figure spoke again, its voice dark and resonant, like it came from the depths of the earth itself. You don't belong here, but that doesn't matter now. You've crossed the line, and there is no going back. Brielle's pulse raced. The shadows seemed to grow deeper, the forest closing in on her, pressing in from all sides. She took a step back, but the figure was already moving toward her, its presence too overwhelming to ignore. No, no, she gasped, trying to push away the sense of dread that clung to her. She needed to get away. She needed to find an escape, but the trees were closing in, and the silence was broken only by the sound of her own racing heartbeat. The figure's mask tilted again, almost as if it were smirking. You think you can run from it, it said, its voice smooth, almost hypnotic. There is no escape from what you've unleashed. And with that, the shadows seemed to rise, curling around her legs, tugging at her, as the forest itself seemed to come alive, reaching for her, pulling her deeper into its heart. The shadows tightened around Brielle's legs like cold, suffocating hands, pulling her toward the figure that loomed over her. The forest itself seemed to hum with a malevolent energy, the trees bending toward her, their branches twisting like claws reaching for her skin. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and every instinct screamed at her to run. But the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. It was soft, yielding, like the earth itself wanted to swallow her whole. Please, Brielle gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to. I don't even know what I'm doing here. The figure remained still, its featureless face absorbing the dim light, its presence so overpowering it was as if the very air had thickened with its weight. There was no pity in its silence, no mercy in the way it watched her struggle. It was as though it knew what she was, knew what she had become. You should have known, it said, its voice cold and detached, each word like a slow, deliberate cut. You've already broken the barrier, and the price is always steep. Brielle's throat tightened, fear choking her. She could feel the darkness pressing in from all sides, a physical force pushing her toward the figure's outstretched hand. Her heart raced as she tried to push against the weight of it, but her movements were sluggish, her legs no longer obeying her commands. The shadows were pulling her down, suffocating her. What do you want from me? She cried out, panic rising in her chest. Tell me what's happening. I just want to go back. The figure's form shifted, its movements fluid, almost serpentine. It glided toward her, its voice lowering to a whisper that cut through the still air like a blade. You're already in it, Brielle, it said, its tone laden with dark finality. This forest, this world, isn't a place you return from. It's the one you've entered into. Brielle's eyes widened. No, no, this can't be. Everything you've done, every choice, every step, led you here. The line is crossed. The door is open. The words hit her like a blow. It was all connected. The whispering shadows, the strange place that had appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't just some random nightmare. It was a destination, and she was trapped in it. She had chosen to cross into this world, even though she hadn't known it. The price of her decision was now settling in, a weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her head spun, but the figure wasn't finished. You've unlocked the forest's heart. You've awakened it, it said, its voice rising, dark and dangerous. And now it's awake, and it won't let you leave. Brielle's mind raced, frantic thoughts tumbling over each other. But one question broke through it all. Alex. She didn't care about the darkness. She didn't care about the figure standing before her or the ominous force closing in. She needed to find him. If there was a chance, a thread of hope, no matter how small, it was in the possibility that he was still here, somewhere alive. I have to find him, Brielle said, her voice raw, desperate. I have to get out of here. I have to find him. The figure tilted its head, its inhuman presence looming closer, the shadows surrounding it warping unnaturally. It was like a thing born from the dark, moving within it, becoming part of it. You don't understand. Its voice was a low murmur now, almost pain. There is no out. There is only the cycle. You've opened the door to this world, and now you're part of it, just like everyone before you. Brielle's heart slammed against her chest. Cycle? She tried to shake off the panic flooding her system, tried to focus, to grasp the meaning of its words. What do you mean? What cycle? The figure stepped forward, its form shifted, coiling like smoke. It raised a hand, and Brielle's body went stiff, as if some unseen force held her in place. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her chest felt like it was being crushed. The cycle of those who wander into the heart of this world, the figure said, almost sorrowful, as if it pitied her. They come, they open the door, and they are never allowed to leave. You think Alex is still alive. You think he escaped. No, he is part of the forest now. And soon, you will be too. The words pierced her like ice, cold and sharp, sinking deep into her soul. Her mind raced to understand, to fight against it, but it was too much. Her vision blurred, her thoughts tangled in a web of fear. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. As the realization dawned, Alex was gone. He wasn't coming back. Not from this place. Not from this cycle. No. Brielle screamed, her body jerking in a futile attempt to break free. I won't accept that. I won't. The figure's voice softened. There is no escape. Not for you. Not for him. The forest claims those who enter. It owns them now. With a forceful pull, the shadows tightened again around Brielle, dragging her deeper into the earth. The air was thick, like something was closing in on her, suffocating her, as the world around her seemed to crumble away. Desperation flared in her chest, a flicker of defiance. I won't be another victim, she hissed, her voice a raw whisper. I'll find a way out. I'll destroy this place if I have to. The figure laughed, a sound that sent cold shivers down her spine. You'll try, Brielle, but you'll never escape what's been set in motion. You cannot undo the forest's will. And just as the shadows threatened to pull her into the earth, something shifted, far off, faint, but unmistakable. A figure emerged from the darkness, standing in the distance. Brielle's heart froze as she saw the outline of a person, a silhouette standing tall, as if waiting for her. A flicker of hope sparked in her chest, Alex. But no, this figure wasn't Alex. It was someone else. Someone, or something, coming for her. The figure in the distance stepped forward, its outline growing clearer with each agonizing second. Brielle's heart hammered in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run, to escape. But her body was frozen in place. The shadows around her constricted, squeezing tighter, as if the forest itself was holding her captive, unwilling to let her move an inch. Her eyes locked onto the approaching figure. It was tall, cloaked in a dark, tattered garment that seemed to absorb the light. The air around it crackled with an eerie energy, and Brielle could feel it in her bones. This was not someone coming to rescue her. This was something far worse. The figure halted a few feet away, its face hidden in the folds of the dark hood, its presence heavy, like a storm on the horizon. You have come, it said, its voice deep, resonant and cold, like the earth itself had spoken. I've waited. Brielle's throat tightened. Her mind screamed for answers, but she couldn't form the words. There was something about this figure, something ancient, something terrifying, that sent a chill so deep it felt like her very soul was being pulled toward it. You've waited for me, she managed to croak, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her ears. What are you? The figure tilted its head, and for a brief moment, Brielle thought she saw a flicker of recognition in its eyes, though they were shrouded in shadow. I am what was promised, the figure said, its voice now almost a whisper, as if speaking a secret only the trees could understand. I am what you sought. Brielle's mind raced. She didn't know what it meant, but she felt the weight of those words like a curse. I didn't seek anything, she spat. frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. I just wanted to find Alex. You sought answers, the figure interrupted, its tone more forceful now. You sought the truth of what lies beyond, of what was hidden from you. And now you found it, but you don't yet understand. Brielle's blood ran cold. Her breath came faster, and the shadows around her seemed to tighten their grip, pulling at her like invisible hands. Her vision blurred, but she focused on the figure, desperate for any clue, anything that could explain this nightmare. I don't care about whatever this is, she shouted, pushing against the unseen force that held her in place. I need to find Alex. He's here. He's somewhere. I know it. Hi. The figure stepped closer, the air around it thick with an unnatural chill. He is here, it said, its voice quiet, almost pity. But he is not the same. You are not the same either. Brielle's heart stopped. The figure's words cut through her like shards of glass. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling with fear. The figure raised a hand, palm open, and Brielle felt the ground beneath her shift, tremble, as though it was alive. And then, suddenly, there was a flash of light. The world around her seemed to fragment and twist, reality bending in impossible ways. Her breath caught in her throat as the shadows flickered and began to reveal something hidden, something buried deep beneath the surface of this twisted world. The ground cracked open, and from it emerged a form, a figure, motionless, trapped in the dirt. Brielle's eyes went wide as she recognized the face. Alex, his body lay in the earth, still and cold, his eyes staring blankly ahead, his skin pale, almost lifeless. He was here, but it wasn't the Alex she had known. His eyes shifted, a faint glimmer of recognition flickering through the glassy depths. Brielle's heart ached. She reached out, but the shadows around her twisted violently, forcing her back. No, she cried out desperate. No, this isn't it. This isn't my brother. The figure standing before her remained motionless, as though watching her every movement. Its voice was almost serene now, like a dark lullaby, full of sorrow and finality. This is the price of crossing the threshold. This is the truth you sought. Brielle's stomach twisted, her hands clenched into fists. No, he's alive. I know he is. The figure raised its hand again, and the world around Brielle shifted, like she was drowning in the shadows. Time felt distorted, and for a moment, everything faded away, leaving only the memory of Alex's face, his smile, his voice, his laugh. Then suddenly the forest exploded with sound, a roar that shook the trees, echoed through the ground, and rattled her very bones. It was something primal, something ancient. Brielle stumbled, feeling the earth beneath her shift, and before she could comprehend what was happening, the figure raised its hand once more, and the shadows parted. A new presence emerged from the depths of the dark, something far more terrifying than anything Brielle had faced so far. A creature, monstrous in scale, crawled from the shadows, its eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. Its body was a twisting mass of shadows and limbs that seemed to stretch and shift in impossible ways. It was the source of the forest's darkness, the thing that had watched her, that had waited for her. Her eyes locked onto its eyes, her heart hammering in her chest, as the world around her seemed to spin out of control. She couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. This is the true price. The figure intoned, its voice devoid of pity. And now you'll join the rest of us in the darkness. Brielle's chest tightened, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She had to do something, anything, to break free, to save herself, and maybe, just maybe, to save Alex. The creature loomed closer, its form filling her vision, as the world around her closed in, and the shadows seemed to rise with a terrible force. But then something inside her snapped, a surge of energy, of defiance, coursed through her. Her body trembled with it, as if every fiber of her being refused to succumb to the darkness. The figure, the creature, the forest, they had no hold on her. She would fight, with a primal scream. Brielle pushed forward, the shadows recoiling in terror. The ground beneath her trembled. The very air crackled as she stepped into the heart of the darkness, determined to find the truth, to break the cycle, no matter the cost. But the creature's roar echoed, a deafening sound, as everything around her began to crumble. Brielle's heart raced as the world around her began to unravel. The creature's terrible roar was deafening, and the shadows churned like a storm, swirling and crashing into one another. She could feel the darkness closing in, pressing against her, as if it were alive, hungry for her very soul. But through the chaos, one thought burned bright in her mind. Asterisk, she couldn't let it win. She couldn't let the darkness consume everything. Asterisk. The surge of energy inside her flared again, and this time, it felt different, stronger, more focused. Brielle's feet pounded the earth, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she pushed forward, her eyes locked onto the creature's glowing, predatory gaze. She had no plan, no strategy, just sheer willpower, and in that moment, she realized it didn't matter. The shadows recoiled before her, as if afraid of the power she now held within. With each step, the ground beneath her pulsed with light, the earth quaking as if the very fabric of the forest was being torn apart. The creature growled, its massive limbs twitching, but Brielle was undeterred. She was no longer running from the darkness. She was fighting it. With a final, desperate push, Brielle reached the heart of the forest. The creature's roar reached a crescendo, but she didn't flinch. She stretched her hands out, feeling the energy within her flow like a river, surging through every inch of her being. The darkness trembled, recoiling as the light broke through, chasing it back into the shadows. For a brief moment, everything went still. The forest, once alive with malevolent whispers and dark energy, was quiet. Brielle stood, her body trembling with exhaustion, but she felt a weight lifting from her chest, as if the very air had changed. The darkness had been driven back, at least for now. And then she heard it, a soft voice, distant but familiar. Brielle! She turned, and there, emerging from the fading shadows, was Alex. His eyes were clear, no longer glazed with the lifelessness that had marked him before. He looked at her with recognition, with hope. "I knew you would find me," he whispered, his voice filled with both gratitude and wonder. Brielle couldn't believe it. She ran to him, her heart leaping with joy and relief. The forest around them seemed to shift, as though the very world had accepted their victory. The shadows no longer felt oppressive, the danger no longer imminent. For the first time in what felt like forever, Brielle could breathe freely again. Together, they stood in the heart of the forest, no longer just survivors, but conquerors. They had broken the cycle, defeated the darkness, and found each other once more. As they walked away from the heart of the forest, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, casting a golden light over the landscape. The world, once consumed by shadows, was now alive with the promise of a new beginning. And as Brielle and Alex stepped out of the forest, a sense of peace washed over them. The darkness had lost. The cycle was broken. If you've enjoyed this thrilling adventure, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us for more captivating stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Stay tuned for more tales that will transport you to worlds beyond your imagination.